The more one digs into this Gary Lineker story, the more outrageous it is and the more the worms start wriggling to the surface. I mean, Tim Davie, the Director General of the BBC, he's actually a past Conservative candidate and a deputy chairman of a local Conservative party, the Fulham and Hammersmith party. How on earth can he be impartial? Richard Sharp, somebody who sat round a table discussing an £800,000 loan for the former Prime Minister, or not. But he certainly sat round the table and he's certainly described as a friend of Boris. A friend of Boris, it sounds like a friend of Dorothy, doesn't it? But then we're not really discussing Mr. Putin. Andrew Neil, impartial? Hardly. Andrew Neil, he's not there now. Of course, he's gone off to, did he go off to GB News? I don't know where he is now. He did go off to GB News, and that wasn't to his liking. And he was editing The Spectator. And fairly, under his editorial leadership, fairly right-wing stuff coming out. Alan Sugar. The Alan Sugar tweets. Astonishingly direct. There was one tweet with, I don't need to go in it. All you need to do is go and have a look at his own Twitter feed. His attacks on Mr. Corbyn and so on. And of course, as we know, when Gary Lineker attacked Bin Corbyn, he didn't get into any trouble. Nick Robinson, former Young Conservative. Robbie Gibb. Allegra Stratton. She ended up in number 10. The list goes on and on and on of the links between the Conservative Party and the people who are high flyers in the BBC. Now, of course, you could say, well, they all come from a similar stock. They're all sort of Oxbridge. They've all got this background of journalistic ease and university comfort. I'm not suggesting we should be discriminating against people with that background. I'm simply saying that the idea that Gary Lineker should be suspended. I mean, more than that, when you look at the texts which are going out, initially the BBC stated that there was a mutual agreement, or at least applied, there was a mutual agreement between Gary Lineker and the BBC for him to step back until a social policy media, until a social media policy was agreed. But that isn't really what happened. He was suspended. And if there was a mutual plan for him to step back, then presumably all his colleagues would not simply have walked out today. But they have walked out. He was bullied into suspension. There was no mutual respect. There was no mutual agreement. His colleagues came out in support of his treatment. Effectively a general strike by the BBC sports people. I hope that general strike spreads across the BBC, because it's time for the people in charge of the BBC to take note. There is nothing wrong with somebody who is not a newscaster expressing a political view. We'd like them to express political views. We want that information. We want some sort of leadership. If we're not going to get it from the front bench of the Conservative Party, and if we're not going to get it from the front bench of the Labour Party, if all we're going to get from both front benches is slogans and no reason, then we might as well hear what ordinary people who happen to have a voice are tweeting, are thinking. The Lineker story shows the BBC in squalid technicolor. It shows that the BBC has, particularly since the days of Mrs. Thatcher, since the days when Mrs. Thatcher criticised the BBC for being too left-wing, it has become a poodle for the Conservative government. Gary Lineker was exercising his free speech. That's something which I believe is a human right. I know it's something that that Suella Braverman wishes to suppress, but it is a human right. And Gary Lineker was supporting a group of people who are really the most vulnerable: refugees, migrants, asylum seekers. He was critiquing government plans. He wasn't even critiquing a law. He was critiquing the language of the government front bench, because nobody else was. And in return, the BBC tries to make him sound as if he's doubting himself. They try effectively to gaslight him. Oh, it's your decision. You took a decision with us to step back. No, you didn't. We bullied you into suspension. If you really want to take that decision, BBC, why don't you fire him? Stand by your principles, and we will all turn off. And we will surrender back our licence fees. And then you will crumble, and then, no doubt, Nadine Dorries and her ilk will be dancing a dance of delight. I'm sure that in the end this has a longer pedigree, and that this is a battle which is designed to wreck the BBC from within. And I think really we should stand up for the BBC. I think we should write letters to the Director General and the Chairman of the BBC. We should tell them both to leave, and we should get new leadership from the BBC, a new direction, and move forward. Because under the same people, we cannot move forward. I've worked for the BBC. They don't pay very much, and they are rather remiss, actually, in producing contracts. They only produced a contract for me when it looked like I was going to be going elsewhere. And then it was all a bit late. And then when I dithered, they contacted me and said, "I'm so sorry, you're not going to be doing this." Well, that's because there were talks behind the scene. This is an old boys' club. Sorry I don't belong to it. But I think the BBC, in principle, could do a good job and has done a good job. This is not an example of that. We need the old BBC back. And we need a government that we can trust. And I think it's not about a choice between the Conservative government and a Labour government. It's about resetting our values. Our values are shot to pieces because we have given in to a sort of sloganising without listening to what's going on. The place to be debating is in the chamber of the House of Commons, not on the pages of Twitter, not on the BBC, not leaking things to the newspapers first. The Speaker of the House of Commons is quite right to rap a number of people on the wrists about the leaks that they make. They're wrong. They're simply wrong. It's not that the Commons should hear of this first. The Commons should debate this first. And that level of debate is not to be found in the Commons at the moment. It might be found in the House of Lords. In fact, I'd say it is found in the House of Lords, but it is not found in the Commons. In the Commons, what we hear is one person shouting over another. What we hear is sloganising. What we hear, effectively, is bullying. And we are then expected to think that one person in the House of Commons is a greater bully than anybody else. I don't believe it, I'm afraid. I was talking today to somebody who knows the great Dominic Raab, and an eyebrow was raised when I asked whether or not he thought that the bullying allegations were genuine. An eyebrow was raised, and we continued the conversation elsewhere. I don't think Dominic Raab is somebody who greatly endears himself to the people with whom he works. But as I say, I think when it comes to bullying is a culture. a culture that manifests itself in individuals, but it is a culture nevertheless, and an administration which prides itself on shouting and sloganizing and pushing people around should not be surprised if occasionally there are bullies in its patch. We know of one anyway, don't we? Pretty.